Joining me now, Anthony Scaramucci, former White House Communications Director, founder of Skybridge Capital, and as of yesterday, congratulations, co-host of the podcast, The Rest is Politics. Yay! That's so great. We'll get to hear you all the time talking about these things. So, Anthony, my
thanks,
friend, you were involved in Trump's 2016 campaign. You were in the White House when Trump won. What can you tell us about how far and wide Trump's alleged dalliances were known among staffers? And was there any direction on how folks should respond publicly to the allegations?
Well, listen, honestly, it was never talked about. Was there an undercurrent that Mr. Trump had dalliances? Yes, there definitely was. I think he did a good job, frankly, of keeping that in a close loop of a few people. I think that the imposition on Hope Hicks and Sarah Huckabee Sanders is sad for them, because both of those people are really good people. And this is what Donald Trump does to people. He puts them in this loyalty trap. And so both of those people have high morals and they're good standing people. And then Trump forces his nonsense on them. And then they now have a loyalty test in terms of dealing with what he wants them to do. And obviously, this is what happened to Michael Cohen. And so one thing Mr. Trump is very, very good at, Alex, is moving the goalposts on people. I think what was most interesting about the testimony over the last couple of days is that David Pecker has seen this movie before. And so he was not interested in having the goalposts moved on him. He was willing to do a few favors for Mr. Trump. And then he decided that that was going to be enough from him. He wasn't going to be Mr. Trump's piggy bank. And so it's a frustrating thing because, listen, everybody's innocent until proven guilty. And this is a criminal case. So I'll just say everybody's innocent until proven guilty. But let's face it, people on that campaign team knew about the veracity of the facts associated with this case.
So Hope Hicks being named on the prosecution witness list, how pivotal a role might she play in the trial?
Listen, she's a really good person. I have an enormous amount of respect for her, and I think she's going to tell the truth. And so whatever her truth is in terms of her interactions, she'll end up telling the truth. Now, the problem with all that is she likes Mr. Trump, and she's been loyal to Mr. Trump. And this is where you get that intersection. This is what Rona Graff faced as well. You're now on the line. Somebody has broken the law. This is obviously it's an election interference issue, which is a very serious issue. It's not just a hush money case. And so I'm sure Hope is being well advised by her lawyers. Under no circumstances can you commit perjury in a case like this. And just be careful, because the government has access to lots and lots of information. And so you got to tell the truth. And I hope that she'll do that, even if it hurts Mr. Trump.
Do you have any sense of any kind of relationship between them now, if they stay in communication? I'm talking about Hopi, as Donald Trump would call her.
Yeah, I actually don't. I know that, one of my good friends that I worked with at Goldman Sachs recently married Hope. I wish them great success. And she's a lovely person. But again, this is just the problem of working with Mr. Trump. And so maybe people that are thinking about working for Mr. Trump don't watch MSNBC. But by chance, if you are, don't work for Mr. Trump, because he will put you in a situation that's indescribable, and you'll be painted into the corner before long. And you're going to really regret that you worked for him. So don't work for Mr. Trump. I think that's the resonating message of the last 8 days of this trial.
As the Trump team is trying to put together a whole host of new employees potentially to join him in the White House were he to win the election. But let's move on to David Pecker, who laid bare really the worst aspects of the catch and kill and the payment to Stormy Daniels as well. How do you think Trump might have felt hearing all of that?
Well, he probably feels that Mr. Pecker crossed the line of loyalty, but Mr. Pecker, frankly, did not cross the line of loyalty. I think that when that plan was conceived, people had to know that in the event that light was shined on that plan, everybody was going to have an obligation to protect themselves. So I understand that Mr. Trump said that the testimony was breathtaking and there was some mocking references to the testimony. But I've had lunch with David before. I have respect for David as a business person. And I think David is a very wise person. He's seasoned. And I think he did the right thing in the court by explaining to people what actually happened. Now, you could say, well, did he do the right thing by getting involved with Mr. Trump in the first place? I mean, listen, obviously, he probably wishes and regrets that he did that. But, he's an honest person, and he gave very direct, very honest testimony. And so we'll have to see what happens here. But I know Mr. Trump well enough to know that he is upset and, quote unquote, mad at David Pecker for giving that testimony. But he really didn't have a choice but to give that testimony. When you're under oath like that and you yourself could go to jail, the right thing to do is just tell the truth.
Yeah. Let's take a listen together to how Suzanne Craig described Donald Trump in court. Here it is.
Donald Trump came in this morning and he looked tired. I think we all were tired. He particularly looked tired, and he did have his eyes closed for most of the day. I can't say he was sleeping. Sometimes he is listening when he has his eyes closed, but he looked fatigued when he came in.
Look, having been on the campaign trail in 2016 with Donald Trump, how do you perceive the way he's absorbing the daily grind of this trial? With all of his late night Truth Social posts, not being able to drink the reported up to, a dozen during the day, Diet Cokes. I mean, this guy is 8 years older than he was when you were spending that kind of time with him.
Yeah. Well, listen, he looks terrible. I mean, who's kidding who? I mean, the question, though, is what's going to be the aftermath of this. And so I said on The Rest is Politics, the U.S. version of the podcast on Friday, that he probably doesn't go to jail. Let's say the worst thing happens to him. He'll probably be confined. I don't think they're going to put a former president in jail. He probably ends up with an embarrassing ankle bracelet, and then he'll have to campaign over Zoom for a period of time. But it is embarrassing. There's no question about this. His lovely wife's birthday was this past week. This is an ironic twist. He's wishing her a happy birthday from the courtroom where this is a hush money case related to a prostitute that he slept with. And so, I mean, this is sort of the bizarre stuff that goes on in the Trump world. I guess the real question we have to ask rhetorically, how is this man still standing for president? And what does it say about you if you're supporting Mr. Trump at this moment in U.S. history? And so I would really caution people about all this. I think that the next 6 months for Mr. Trump are going to be worse for him than the prior 6 months. He's not only has to face this, he will probably likely face one or two other charges. People seem to think that this is going to get delayed by the Supreme Court. I'm going to take the other side of that. I think that this case starts. The court's not going to grant him absolute immunity. If they do that, it would be almost like a reneging of the Constitution. Yeah. So I don't see that happening. I see him in court again before we get to Election Day. And I think he'll be even more miserable than he is today.
Yeah, but can I say that question you just posed? Boy, that is the money question. You just nailed it. Quickly, let me ask you about ByteDance, TikTok. ByteDance says it's going to, rather, it won't ever sell TikTok in the U.S. It's just going to shut it down. Do you think that's likely? Would they have incentive to sell?
Well, listen, I mean, you'll learn if this is really controlled by the Chinese government, because, and I believe that it obviously is. I mean, just try to punch in something related to Tiananmen Square, and you'll see how that doesn't get any exposure in their algorithm. And so if it's related to the Chinese government, which I believe it is, I think that's the right course for them. The government doesn't care. They have unlimited amounts of money. They'll shut it down. It'll be a spiteful thing to do, but it'll be a telling thing to do, because there'll be lots of people in the United States that say, oh, look at this. We don't really actually believe in the First Amendment. We had something controlled by the Chinese government that we didn't allow into the system. And so I think we have to have a reckoning with all of this at this point, Alex. That Constitution has not been amended properly since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I think we're due for a constitutional amendment. That's a living document. It has to be reset. And I think we have to really think about what free speech is in this society now. There are people on college campuses talking about the beheading of Jewish babies and death to Jewish people. I mean, I find this absolutely reprehensible. and we have to speak out against this type of hate speech.
Yeah.
But as it relates to the Chinese government, if they shut down TikTok, goodbye and good riddance. There'll be something else that the United States, this wonderful country of innovation, will create in social media that'll be even better than TikTok. So if they shut it down, goodbye and good riddance. If they don't, I'd like to see one of my friends like Steven Mnuchin or Bobby Kotick take control of it. But remember, they won't get that algorithm. So it'll be a hard thing to take over TikTok, is my opinion.
Yeah, and make it feel as it is right now. Okay, Anthony Scaramucci, it's always good to talk with you, my friend. Come see me again
Good to be
soon.
here.
Thank you.